The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views or positions of the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures or Baylor University. Welcome to Episode 7 of In Other Worlds, a podcast series presented by the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. In this series, we will introduce you to research conducted by members of our faculty, some of our programs, and highlight student experiences. Our guest today is Professor Cristian Bratu, who is also the Division Director for French and Italian within the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures. Thank you for agreeing to be our guest today, Dr. Bratu. Professor Bratu is a medievalist, and his research focuses on medieval chronicles and authorship, mostly in French, but not exclusively. Professor Bratu is going to guide us through this area of his research. And he is the author of this book, and I'm going to ask him to read the title for you.
It is called Je, auteur de ce livre, l'affirmation de soi chez les historiens de l'Antiquité à la fin du Moyen Age.
And can you provide a translation of the title?
Yes, it means I, author of this book, self-assertiveness in the works of historians from antiquity to the end of the Middle Ages.
Yes, and the book is published by Brill in 2019. I think we'll just jump right into the questions and get this rolling. So, Dr. Bratu, one of the things I like to ask all of our guests is, what brought you into this field of study? How did you become attracted to the study of medieval authorship and chronicles?
Thank you for the invitation, and I would start with medieval authorship. It's kind of an interesting story because when I started doing research in medieval studies, I became interested in medieval authorship simply because I was interested in the idea of authorship. And as a matter of fact, this notion of medieval authorship was a bit of a forbidden fruit, a bit of a taboo at some point, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about why it was a bit of a taboo. For all the right reasons, to be sure, but it was a bit of a taboo to talk about that at that time. And as a matter of fact, my master's thesis advisor in France at the time told me, Cristian, this is not a good topic. You may not want to do this. And, she did it for the right reasons because she was basically trying to tell me, look, this medieval authorship concept is situated beyond these perilous seas that I don't know if you want to navigate. You might hit some underground reefs. And in the end, she saw that I was really motivated by this topic, and she said, well, you can do this, but, be careful, tread lightly. It's tricky. And so when your advisor tells you something like this, you basically have two options. You can say, well, maybe I should back off a little bit and look for something else. Or, and that's what I did. I stuck with it, and I thought, you know what? I like the idea of perilous seas. I'm gonna embark on this voyage and see where it takes me. And maybe I'll find some previously undiscovered islands or a new continent. Who knows? And I'm glad I did this because I think I didn't discover a new continent, but I think I discovered a few interesting textual landscapes, as it were. Medieval chronicles is easy. I always loved history, so theoretically, I'm a literary scholar, but I've always loved history. And we often talk about some medieval history in my classes. I tell my students, look, I know that for you guys, maybe history is, collection of dates and dead people, but you don't have to look at it that way. You should look at it as kind of like a family album that you discover one day and you kind of decide to open it and you realize, oh, I look an awful lot like my grandpa or my grandma. Let me see what, grandma, grandpa did in their lives. And that's your personal history right there. And then, of course, you can expand that to, your larger family, which is the history of humankind. And it's a fascinating discipline, I think, because, history doesn't predetermine the future, but it definitely informs the present. And I think it's important for us to know our history, our histories, because we want to learn from past mistakes. I think it's a very contemporary issue, right? We need to learn from past mistakes. And I think Cicero was right when he said that history is a teacher of life, for life. Historia magistra vitae. So I love these two topics, and I found it a good way to combine research on authorship and history, two things that I
Great.
care about.
Yeah. Well, let me congratulate you on the consistent use of your sea metaphors, uh, perilous seas and reefs and things like that. But you mentioned the taboos associated with this. So can you touch lightly on what you mean by that taboo in this study of this field?
Well, so one of the things that I find fascinating about medieval authorship is that, in a sense, it's a precursor to how we see nowadays writers and authors, but at the same time, it's also very, very different. And when I talk to my students about this, I use another metaphor, not an oceanic maritime metaphor, but I tell them, look, I think this might upset a few medievalists, but I think medieval authorship, in some cases, was very similar to artificial intelligence and how some people use artificial intelligence nowadays. And I tell them, look, of course, because we're talking about the Middle Ages, there was no artificial intelligence back then. It was all exclusively human intelligence. But you basically had two types of people who wrote texts in the Middle Ages. First of all, you had the people who were clerks, who were educated in essentially a church setting. There was a point in the Middle Ages when education was only done in a church setting, and so they learned to read and write classic texts, Latin texts in a church setting, and those are the clerkly writers. And then on the other hand, you have the non-clerkly people who start writing at some point, but oftentimes these are people that, for example, travel to the Middle East, to the Holy Land, participate in the Crusades. And oftentimes these people, although they're extremely important people, kings, princes, dukes, counts, whatever, they're often illiterate or marginally literate. Oftentimes they don't know how to write. Why? Because they're aristocrats. They have other people to write for them. Exactly. And so what happens when these people come back, let's say from the Holy Land, from the Middle East, wherever they went, they sit down with a scribe and they essentially dictate a rough draft. Also, they tell them their memories from the Crusades. And what you have is a very rough draft, and then the scribe later on takes all of this material and then polishes it up and writes the text for this person, right? It's kind of like, again, using the metaphor of artificial intelligence nowadays, you put a few ideas in AI and then you ask it, please rephrase this or please polish it up. And this is what these scribes were doing. They were polishing up a product for someone who could not write really on their own. And so that brings up some ethical questions, just like nowadays the use of AI brings up some ethical questions. Is that text really yours? Can you be called the author of this book if you had someone else essentially writing it for you? And this is where I think, the use of this metaphor kind of ends because that's where the waters part a little bit. In that society, because education back then and literacy was the exception and not the norm, you could ask someone to write this book on your behalf, essentially, and you could be considered a writer, a chronicler, an author. Um, but nowadays, because education is the norm and people know how to read and write for themselves, it would be much trickier
Yeah.
to say that you're the author of a text that was, essentially created by AI.
Okay, great. Um, just for the non-scholars in the audience among our viewers, can you give us a time frame for the area that you study? Middle Ages, most people I think have a concept for, but I think there are different interpretations of what that means. So can you sort of place that for us?
Yes, the Middle Ages is huge. It's essentially over 1,000 years of history. So that's quite a lot. But a lot of the texts produced in that time span were produced in Latin. I'm really interested in the texts that were produced in the vernacular, meaning in French, Old French. And so Old French kind of appears. There's this date, 842, for one of the first documents written in Romance, not quite French yet. But really, French literature starts blooming, blossoming in the 11th, 12th centuries. So really, I work with texts from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Um, but when you're a medievalist, you always have um, this folks who will tell you, well, that's great. It's great that you work on the vernacular, but you also need to know those Latin models. And so oftentimes medievalists have to work with a vernacular language and also Latin text. So that was my case as well. It was fun to read medieval Latin texts.
Cool. All right. Well, tell us, do you have a favorite chronicler or chronicle, or who do you find most interesting among them, or tell us who are the standouts in your view?
I have a few chroniclers that I really, really like. They may not be known by the public, but there are a few that I find extremely interesting, like Jean Froissart, a French chronicler from the 14th century, Philippe de Comines, a 15th century chronicler. And so I'm kind of interested in these guys because essentially, if you think about it, histories and chronicles were supposed to be these almost exclusively third person texts.
Mm.
You start writing a history because someone asked you, because you think that someone is important enough to be the topic of a history, or an event is important enough to be the topic of a certain history. And so you write about a king, you write about a crusade, write about important historical events, you write about a kingdom, always essentially in the third person, right? You always write about someone else. And every now and then, you have these people like Jean Froissart, like Philippe de Comines, who kind of stop talking about a certain historical event and then they start talking about themselves. And it becomes interesting, just like I think, sometimes our students like when we kind of stop the actual class teaching and we talk a little bit about why we're interested in certain topics or what we do. In the same way, I was kind of interested in what these guys have to say about themselves. And it is oftentimes very interesting material. It's oftentimes very interesting things that they have to say about themselves. In two ways. Again, you have these two categories: the clerkly folks, um, who essentially are armchair historians. They're not people who witnessed history firsthand. They're people who have read about it, have heard from knights, from people who participated in certain events, and they wrote down what they heard, but they don't witness history firsthand. And then you have the second category, the people who actually participate in certain events, and for them to talk about the events that they witnessed is actually how they establish their authority, because they're essentially saying, we didn't hear about this, we didn't read about this in a book, we were there, and we can tell you what happened.
Okay.
And so that physical presence there is how they establish their authority. So these people who talk about themselves are kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, that's great. And that you partially answered one of my other questions about how medieval chroniclers established their authority. But I think it's interesting because in the modern day historical writing, we don't value eyewitness events of history as much as we do someone who's describing it more, what we consider to be more objectively, with some distance, in the third person.
Right.
Do you find that
Yes,
to be the case?
you're right. It's two very different types of history. So in a way, these clerkly historians are the predecessors of academic historians, right? So people who research documents, events, people, and then who end up writing about it. And then you also have sometimes, memoirs written by various generals, and who obviously provide a very subjective history, which will then later be analyzed by the more academic people. So, in a sense, in the Middle Ages, you have the origins of these two very different types of histories: academic history, and then more personal, subjective memoirs.
Yeah, it reminds me of, in some ancient Russian chronicles or bardic historians, at the very end, they would say, uh, "And I have witnessed these events with my own eyes. There was wine, but I wasn't drinking." It's like, okay. Well, this has been very fascinating. So tell us, so what is next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, after I completed this book, I thought I might need a little break from chronicles. Maybe I can start working on something a little bit different. And it's interesting because I thought, I need a mental break from this. Maybe I should travel a little bit, not physically, well, maybe physically as well, but also just intellectually and focus on travel writing. And so this is what I'm working on right now. Of course, I say that I needed a bit of a break from chronicles, but really, if you know how some of these chronicles are, if you've read them, you know that many chronicles read a little bit like travel narratives.
Travel.
There's, genres in the Middle Ages, possibly like in certain types of literature today, are not these very clearly separated drawers that
Right.
there's no communication between them. A lot of memoirs happen to be also travel narratives and also chronicles. And so I started with those texts that I'm familiar with, and then I started expanding a little bit beyond chronicles to French travel writing. I'm now reading some Russian medieval travel writing, which I find fascinating. I've also read some Arab travel writers, also some Spanish travel writers. So I'm trying to expand a little bit beyond the borders of France and the French-speaking realm in the Middle Ages. And it allows me also to travel vicariously through reading. It's fun to travel to Constantinople,
Sure.
knowing that Constantinople doesn't really exist anymore in that form.
Right. Great. Well, we've come to the end of our time today, and I want to thank our guest, Dr. Bratu. And if you have enjoyed this episode of In Other Worlds, please consider making a donation to our Departmental Excellence Fund by clicking on the QR code that you can see on the screen. Contributions made to the Excellence Fund support faculty research and student experiences and enable Baylor to drive tuition down. Join us next month for episode 8 of In Other Worlds, when our guest will be Professor Yuko Prefume, who will appear with students who have been participating in the Japanese speech contest, both in the state of Texas and nationally.